The
Olha ali,
sound
pai.
of
Tenho
silverware
certeza
against
de que é
porcelain
ele.
Mas como
cut
isso
through
é
the
possível?
silence like
O que ele
blades.
está fazendo
In the
aqui?
large hall,
Acalmem-se, meus
the man
filhos.
watched his motionless father, confined to a chair near the window, when the skinny boy, holding a crumpled envelope, said what he shouldn't have. "Your girlfriend doesn't let your father walk." The air froze. Something shattered, though no sound confirmed it. Before we dive into this story, leave a comment with a rating from 1 to 10 and tell us which city you're watching from. May this moment bring reflection and emotion to your heart. The morning arrived grey over the mansion, as if the sky knew that secrets weighed upon those walls. Edward adjusted his tie in front of the mirror, preparing for another day of a routine that pretended to be normal. 3 years since he had brought Helen to live there. 3 years since his father, after the stroke, had needed constant care. 3 years of pretending everything was fine. Outside, the wind swayed the trees in the immense garden, creating dancing shadows that played with the light filtering through the heavy curtains. The house breathed luxury in every detail. Mahogany furniture, Persian rugs, crystals that reflected the morning light like tiny trapped rainbows. But there was something in the air, a tension that not even all the refinement could mask. Edward descended the marble staircase, each step echoing in the silence. The sound reached the dining room before he did, announcing his presence like a distant drum. Helen was already at the table, elegant as always, wearing a blue silk robe that enhanced her light-colored eyes. She lifted her face and smiled, a perfect practiced smile that never reached her eyes. "Good morning, my love," she said, her voice as smooth as honey. "Did you sleep well?" Edward nodded, but his gaze was already searching for his father. Francis was in his wheelchair, positioned near the window overlooking the garden. The old man, who had once commanded a company with a firm fist, now seemed a shadow of his former self. His eyes were half closed, his body rigid, his fingers, which once trembled, now remained motionless on the plaid blanket covering his legs. "How was his night?" Edward asked, approaching his father's chair. "Quiet," Helen replied, not looking up from the newspaper. "Mrs. Marcia said he slept all night." Mrs. Marcia, the caregiver Helen had hired 2 months ago after dismissing Connie, the old nurse who had cared for his father since the stroke. The change had been sudden, justified with words about modernizing care and seeking more specialized professionals. Edward hadn't questioned it at the time. He had trusted her. Breakfast proceeded in the same silence as always. Helen flipped through the society pages, commenting on charity galas and openings. Edward ate without paying attention, his eyes constantly on his father. Francis remained motionless, his gaze lost beyond the window, as if contemplating a world only he could see. It was when the sound of hurried footsteps echoed in the hallway that the routine was broken. James, the driver, appeared at the dining room door, holding the hand of a skinny boy, about 10 years old, with simple clothes and hair disheveled by the wind. "Sorry to bother you." "Mr. Edward," James said, taking off his cap. "But the boy insists on delivering a message from the field workers." The boy held a crumpled envelope against his chest, his large, curious eyes scanning the luxurious room with a mixture of admiration and embarrassment. He was the son of one of the farmhands. Edward knew this by the familiar face, though he couldn't recall exactly whose. "You can give it to me," Edward said, extending his hand. The boy approached timidly, handing over the envelope. But his eyes couldn't stop wandering around the room, settling on the motionless figure of Francis. There was something in the child's gaze, an innocent curiosity mixed with a disturbance that only childish sincerity can express. Helen watched the scene with a forced smile, clearly annoyed by the unexpected presence. She didn't like being seen in her private space by outsiders, as she used to say. The image of the perfect family was something she cultivated with dedication. "Thank you for the message," Edward said, putting the envelope in his pocket. "James, you can take the boy back now." But the boy didn't move. He kept looking at Francis, his brow furrowed, as if trying to understand something that troubled him. Helen noticed the prolonged gaze, and her expression hardened almost imperceptibly. "Is there a problem?" she asked, her voice maintaining its sweetness, but with a note of impatience that Edward knew well. The boy looked at her, then at Edward, and finally at Francis again. The innocence of childhood knows no diplomacy or social conventions, so when he opened his mouth, the words came out unfiltered, laden with a brutal truth that no adult would have the courage to utter. "Your girlfriend doesn't let your father walk." The silence that followed was so dense that the air seemed to freeze. The clatter of silverware against porcelain ceased abruptly. Helen let the newspaper slip from her fingers. Edward felt the world stop around him, each of the boy's words echoing in his mind like a bell tolling in a cemetery. "What did you say?" Edward whispered, his voice hoarse. The boy, realizing he had said something important, but not fully understanding the weight of his words, continued with the same disconcerting sincerity. "Yesterday, I saw him trying to get up from the chair in the garden. She yelled at the lady who takes care of him and said he had to stay still. He was crying." Helen rose slowly, her face pale, but trying to maintain her composure. She laughed, but the sound was metallic, artificial. "What a vivid imagination," she said, walking toward the boy. "Children are always making up stories, aren't they?" But Edward wasn't listening to Helen's excuses. His eyes were fixed on his father, searching for signs, for clues that could confirm or deny the child's words. Francis remained motionless, but something in his expression had changed. A single tear rolled down his wrinkled face. The boy saw the tear too, and pointed with a small finger. "Look, he's crying again." James, sensing the growing tension, held the boy's hand more firmly. "Come on, son. We've delivered the message." But the damage was done. The words had been spoken, and now they hung in the air like smoke that wouldn't dissipate. Edward looked at Helen, searching her eyes for an explanation, a convincing denial. He found only a cold, calculating gaze he didn't recognize. "Edward," Helen began, her voice regaining its forced softness, "you're not going to believe a child's fantasies, are you?" He didn't answer immediately. He approached his father's chair and knelt beside it. Francis turned his head slightly, just enough to meet his son's eyes. In that look, Edward saw something that terrified him, a silent plea. "Dad," Edward whispered, holding the old man's cold, stiff hand. "Can you hear me?" Francis blinked once, slowly, deliberately. Helen watched the scene with growing nervousness, her hands trembling slightly as she smoothed her silk robe. The boy was still there, an inconvenient witness to a moment that should have remained private. "James," Helen said, her voice now authoritative, "take the boy away, now." "Wait." Edward stood up, his gaze still fixed on Helen. "I want to hear what he has to say." The boy looked from one adult to the other, feeling the tension, but still not fully comprehending that his words had opened a door everyone preferred to keep shut. "He always tries to walk when you're not looking," the boy said, his voice low as if sharing a secret. "And she always gets mad at the lady who takes care of him. Says he has to stay put or he'll get hurt." Edward felt a chill run down his spine. He looked at his father again, and this time Francis managed to articulate a sound, low, almost inaudible, but unmistakably a word. "Lie." Helen stiffened. The boy looked at Francis with curiosity. "What did he say?" "Nothing," Helen interrupted quickly. "He hasn't been able to speak properly since the stroke. They're just sounds." But Edward had heard, and for the first time in 3 years, he began to question whether he really knew the woman with whom he shared his bed, his home and his father's life. The boy, realizing he had caused some kind of trouble, began to back away toward James. Before leaving, he looked one last time at Francis and waved shyly. "Bye, Mr. Francis. I hope you get better soon." And then they were gone, leaving behind a silence even heavier than before. Edward remained kneeling beside his father's chair, his mind racing, trying to process what had just happened. Helen stood by the window, her arms crossed, observing the garden as if nothing had occurred. But something had changed. A seed of doubt had been planted, and Edward knew that once it germinated, there would be no ignoring it. The boy, unknowingly, had lit a fuse that would lead to an explosion far greater than his young mind could imagine. The untouched breakfast remained on the table. Outside the window, the clouds thickened, heralding rain, and in the silence of the dining room, 3 people remained trapped in their own thoughts, one struggling to maintain control, another beginning to awaken to the truth, and the third imprisoned in a body that no longer obeyed him. But with a mind that screamed for freedom, the storm was just beginning. The rest of the morning passed in a dense fog. Edward tried to focus on work, but the boy's words echoed in his mind like a scratched record repeating the same line. Your girlfriend doesn't let your father walk. Each time the phrase returned, it brought with it new questions, new suspicions that he tried to push away, but that insisted on growing like weeds in fertile soil. Sitting in his office, paperwork scattered across the solid oak desk, Edward flipped through documents without really reading them. His mind was in the dining room, reliving every detail of that morning. Helen's expression when the boy spoke, the way she had rushed to deny it, the tear on his father's face, that single whispered word, lie. The phone rang, interrupting his thoughts. It was Helen. "Love, will you be home for lunch?" she asked, her voice laden with a sweetness that now sounded forced to Edward's ears. "I will," he replied, surprised by his own distant tone. "Great. I've made that fish you like, and I had Mrs. Marcia give your father his medication early today." He was a bit agitated. Edward felt a pang of something he couldn't name. Agitated. Was his father agitated, or was he trying to communicate something? What kind of agitation? A brief pause, almost imperceptible, but Edward caught it. "Oh, nothing much. You know how he gets sometimes? Mrs. Marcia says it's normal for patients in his condition." Patience in his condition. The phrase sounded strange, too clinical for someone who supposedly loved the family. Edward realized that Helen always spoke of his father as if he were a problem to be managed, not a person to be cared for. "I'll be home for lunch today," he said, hanging up before she could respond. The drive back to the mansion had never seemed so long. Edward drove along the tree-lined roads leading to the property, his mind buzzing with questions that 3 years of routine had put to sleep. When was the last time he had truly talked to his father? When had he questioned the treatment methods? When had he simply paid attention? Guilt was a physical sensation, a weight on his chest that made it hard to breathe. Edward realized he had handed over his father's care completely to Helen, blindly trusting her dedication. But was it really dedication he had seen in her eyes that morning? Upon arriving home, he found Helen in the kitchen, supervising lunch. She was radiant, wearing a floral dress that highlighted her natural beauty. She smiled when she saw him, but Edward noticed something different in her smile, an almost imperceptible tension at the corners of her mouth. "Where's my father?" he asked without preamble. "In his room, resting. Like I said, he was agitated, so Mrs. Marcia thought it best for him to rest." Edward climbed the stairs, each step weighing like lead. His father's room was at the end of the hall, a large room with a view of the garden that Francis had always loved. As a child, Edward had spent hours in that room, listening to the stories his father told about the times he had built the family business with his own hands. The door was ajar. Edward pushed it open slowly and found Francis lying in bed, his eyes closed, his breathing regular. Mrs. Marcia was sitting in an armchair beside him, knitting in silence. "How is he?" Edward whispered. The woman, a middle-aged lady with grey hair in a tight bun, looked up from her knitting. There was something in her expression that Edward couldn't decipher. Fear, perhaps. Or guilt. "Sleeping, Mr. Edward. He took his medication an hour ago." "What medication?" "The usual. To keep him calm." To keep him calm. The words sounded strange. Since when did Francis need medication to be calm? Edward remembered the doctor prescribing medication for circulation and to prevent new strokes, but he didn't recall anything to keep him calm. "Mrs. Marcia, Can I see the medications he's taking? The woman hesitated, her fingers pausing on the knitting. Mrs. Helen handles that, sir. She organizes the schedules. Edward felt a twinge of suspicion. He approached the bedside table, where his father's medications used to be. There was a pill organizer, divided by days of the week. He picked it up and examined the pills. He recognized most of them, but there were others he had never seen before. Mrs. Marcia, how long has my father been taking these blue pills? The woman swallowed hard. About 2 months, sir. Since I started working here. 2 months. Exactly when Connie had been dismissed. Edward filed the information away, deciding to investigate later. For now, he just wanted to watch his father. He sat on the bed next to Francis's still body. The old man seemed thinner, more fragile than Edward remembered. When was the last time he had really looked at him? When had he noticed the changes? As if sensing his son's presence, Francis slowly opened his eyes. For a moment his gaze seemed lost, confused. Then it focused on Edward, and there it was again, that silent plea he had seen that morning. "Dad," Edward whispered, holding the old man's cold hand. "Are you listening to me?" Francis blinked once. Then he tried to move his mouth as if to speak. Edward leaned his ear closer. "Lee," came an almost inaudible whisper. "Lie," Edward completed. "Is that what you're trying to say?" A blink of confirmation. Edward looked at Mrs. Marcia, who had stopped knitting entirely and was watching the scene with growing nervousness. "Mrs. Marcia, I need to speak with you outside." In the hallway, out of Francis's earshot, Edward confronted the caregiver. "I want you to tell me the truth about what's happening here." The woman looked from side to side, as if afraid of being overheard. "Mr. Edward, I just follow instructions." "What instructions?" "Miss Helen said your father shouldn't exert himself, that he could get hurt if he tries to move on his own." "And does he try to move?" Mrs. Marcia hesitated, clearly torn between loyalty to her job and what seemed to be a guilty conscience. "Sometimes," she finally admitted, "especially when he hears noise in the garden. It seems like he wants to go to the window, but Mrs. Helen said it's dangerous, that I have to stop him." Edward's stomach churned. His father had always loved watching the garden, the movement of the birds, the growth of the plants. It was one of the few joys he had left after the stroke. And the medication. Who decided to increase the dosage? "Mrs. Helen consulted the doctor," Mrs. Marcia said quickly. "She said it was for his own good." But there was something in the woman's tone that suggested she had her own doubts. Edward went down to the dining room, where Helen was waiting for him with lunch served. She smiled when she saw him, but her eyes carefully studied his expression. "How is he?" "Sleeping. Mrs. Marcia said you increased his medication." Helen didn't miss a beat, serving the fish with graceful movements. "I consulted Dr. Mendoza. He agreed it would be better to keep your father calmer. Stress isn't good for someone in his condition." Edward watched Helen as she spoke. There was a fluency to her words, as if she had rehearsed this explanation. Too rehearsed to be spontaneous. "I want to talk to Dr. Mendoza." "Of course, love. But he's out of town this week. He's due back next week." There was always a plausible explanation, always a reasonable justification. Edward began to realize that Helen was a master at constructing narratives that sounded true, but were perhaps just carefully built facades. Lunch passed in tense silence. Edward ate without appetite, his mind preoccupied with the morning's revelations. Helen tried to maintain a normal conversation, commenting on the week's social events, the preparations for a charity gala she was organizing. But Edward barely heard her. It was when she mentioned preparations for the future that his attention was captured. "What preparations?" "Oh, nothing major. Just organizing some documents. You know, in case something happens to your father, it's best that everything is in order." Edward felt a chill run down his spine. "What kind of documents?" Helen hesitated for a fraction of a second before answering. "Power of attorney, the will, things like that. Your father signed some papers when he was still more lucid." "Where are these documents?" "In the office." Why all this sudden interest? Edward didn't answer. He finished his lunch in silence, his mind racing. After the meal, he went to the office on the ground floor. It was a space Helen rarely used, preferring the more feminine decor of the living room. He began to go through drawers, looking for the documents Helen had mentioned. He found them in a separate folder, organized with precision. A general power of attorney in Helen's name, changes to the will, transfer of some company shares. Edward sat down heavily in the leather armchair, the documents spread out before him. Everything seemed legal, technically correct, but there was something disturbing about the dates on the signatures, all very recent, all after the stroke, when Francis could barely speak. The sound of footsteps in the hall made him lift his head. Helen appeared at the door, her face trying to maintain its serenity, but her eyes betraying a growing anxiety. "Find what you were looking for? When exactly did my father sign these papers?" "A few months ago. The lawyer came here. Your father was having a better day." Edward studied the handwriting on the documents. Shaky, irregular, but unmistakably Francis's script. Still, something didn't add up. "Helen, I need to ask you a question, and I want you to be honest with me." She approached, sitting in the chair across from the desk. "Of course, love. I've always been honest with you. Did my father really try to get up yesterday?" The silence that followed was deafening. Helen looked at her own hands, then at Edward, and finally at a point on the wall behind him. "Edward, you need to understand. Your father isn't well. If he tries to walk and falls, he could be seriously injured. I'm just protecting him or controlling him." The words came out harsher than Edward had intended, but he didn't regret them. Helen stiffened, her face losing its mask of docility. "How can you say something like that? After everything I've done for this family, for you, for him, what exactly have you done for him?" Helen stood up abruptly, her cheeks flushed. "I take care of him every day, Edward. I'm the one who organizes his medications, supervises his care, who sacrifices so he can be comfortable. And you come to me with accusations based on a child's gossip? It's not gossip if it's true." "True?" Helen laughed, but the sound was bitter. "The truth is your father is senile, Edward. The truth is he barely knows where he is most of the time. The truth is you were so busy with your work that you didn't even notice how much he had deteriorated." The words hit Edward like slaps. There was truth in them, and that hurt more than he expected. He had indeed distanced himself from his father, focusing on work, leaving everything in Helen's hands. "But that doesn't give you the right to decide for him," Edward said, his voice low but firm. Helen looked at him for a long moment, and Edward saw something in her eyes he had never seen before, a calculating coldness that made him question if he really knew the woman in front of him. "You're right," she said finally, her voice regaining its artificial sweetness. "Perhaps I've been overly cautious. How about tomorrow we let him spend some time in the garden?" Edward nodded, but he couldn't shake the feeling that something more was going on, something he hadn't yet discovered. The conversation was over, but the questions remained, multiplying like shadows as the sun sets. That night, Edward couldn't sleep. He lay beside Helen, listening to her steady breathing, wondering how many other secrets might be hidden in that house. Outside, the wind rustled the trees, creating whispers that seemed to echo the boy's words. "Your girlfriend doesn't let your father walk." And in the room at the end of the hall, Francis lay awake in the darkness, his eyes fixed on the ceiling, his mind trapped in a body that no longer obeyed him, but still alert enough to know he was in danger. The dawn arrived shyly, filtered through thick clouds that promised rain. Edward woke before the alarm, his body tense, his mind already racing before he had fully opened his eyes. Helen slept beside him, her face serene, one hand resting on the silk pillow. Looking at her in that moment of vulnerability, Edward tried to reconcile the woman he had met 3 years ago with the suspicions that were now growing in his mind like weeds. He got up silently, put on a robe, and walked down the hall to his father's room. The door was ajar, as always. Francis was asleep, but it was a restless sleep, His body twitched occasionally, as if even unconsciously he was fighting some invisible prison. Edward watched his father for long minutes, searching for signs of the vitality he had once known in that man. Francis Silver had been a giant in Edward's life, a successful businessman, a present father, a man who faced challenges head-on. Seeing that frail body in the bed was like contemplating the ruins of an empire that had once seemed indestructible. "Mr. Edward?" Mrs. Marsh's voice startled him. The woman had entered the room, carrying a tray with medication and a glass of water. "Good morning," Edward whispered. "Is it time for his medication already?" "Mrs. Helen asked to give it early," Mrs. Marsh explained, but there was hesitation in her voice. "She said it would be better to keep him calm during the day." Edward looked at the pills on the tray. Besides the medications he recognized, there were 2 blue pills that were not part of his father's original treatment. "Mrs. Marsh, can I see the prescription for these blue pills?" The woman hesitated, looking at the door as if afraid of being overheard. Mrs. Helen keeps those things." "Where?" "In her office, I believe." Edward nodded, but something in Mrs. Marsh's expression made him press on. "Do you have any concerns about these medications?" Mrs. Marsh looked down, clearly torn between loyalty to her job and what seemed to be a guilty conscience. "Mr. Edward, I'm not a doctor, but I've worked with the elderly for 15 years. Your father seems different, more distant. And he was so active before what? Before the new medication. Before I got here." Edward's stomach tightened. He approached the bed and lightly touched his father's shoulder. "Dad, can you hear me?" Francis opened his eyes slowly, his gaze initially confused, then focusing on his son. There was something different that morning, a clarity Edward hadn't seen in months. "Edward," Francis whispered, his voice weak but clear. Edward's heart raced. It had been so long since he had heard his father say his name with such clarity. "Dad, are you feeling better?" Francis tried to sit up, the movement slow but determined. Mrs. Marsh immediately approached. "Mr. Francis, it's better to lie down." "No," Francis said, his voice gaining strength. "I want to sit up." Edward helped his father sit up in bed, propping him against the headboard. Francis's eyes were more alert than Edward remembered seeing them in months. "Son," Francis said, holding Edward's hand with surprising strength, "I need to tell you something." Mrs. Marsh looked nervously at the door. "Mr. Edward, I think it's better to give him his medication first." "The medication can wait," Edward said firmly. "Dad, what do you want to tell me?" Francis looked at Mrs. Marsh, then at Edward. When he spoke, his voice carried an urgency that made the hair on Edward's neck stand up. "She gives me pills that make me drowsy. She swaps my real medication. What are you saying?" "Helen, she wants me not to walk, not to talk, not to decide anything." The words came out with difficulty, but Francis's mental clarity was undeniable. Edward looked at Mrs. Marsh, who had turned pale. "Is this true, Mrs. Marsh?" The woman began to cry silently. "She threatened me, Mr. Edward. She said she'd fire me if I told anyone. I need this job. I have grandchildren to support." Edward felt a wave of anger mixed with nausea. Helen wasn't just neglecting his father's care. She was deliberately sedating him, keeping him in a state of forced lethargy. "How long has this been going on?" "Since I started working here," Mrs. Marsh confessed. "Mrs. Helen told me they were special pills, that the doctor had prescribed them. But after a few weeks I noticed that when he didn't take the blue pills, he was more awake, more himself." Francis squeezed his son's hand. "Edward, she's taking over everything. Papers, the company, money. When I tried to protest, she increased the pills." Edward closed his eyes, trying to process the magnitude of what he was discovering. Helen wasn't just mistreating his father, she was systematically incapacitating him to gain total control over his assets and decisions. "Mrs. Marsh, where does she keep my father's real medication?" "There's a safe in her office. I've seen her put things in there sometimes." Edward stood up abruptly. "Stay with him. Don't give him any more blue pills. If Helen asks, say he was sleeping. He hurried down the stairs, his heart pounding. Helen's office was on the first floor, a room she had decorated with refined taste, full of flowers and photographs of the family she had built with Edward. Ironically, many of the photos showed happy moments with Francis, smiles that now seemed like sinister masks. The safe was built into the wall, behind a painting. Edward knew the combination, Helen's birthday. When the door opened, he found more than he expected. Besides Francis's original medications, there were documents that made his blood run cold. Fake medical reports, correspondence with lawyers about asset transfers, and most shockingly, a forged psychiatric report declaring Francis incapable of making his own decisions. Edward took the documents with trembling hands. Helen had orchestrated everything with surgical precision. His father's stroke had been just an opportunity. She was using his medical condition as an excuse for an elaborate and meticulous scheme. Found something interesting? Helen's voice behind him made Edward turn quickly. She was at the office door, still in her silk nightgown, but her face no longer showed any trace of sleep. Her eyes were alert, calculating. Helen! Edward tried to keep his voice calm, but his hands trembled holding the documents. Can you explain this to me? She entered the office, closing the door behind her. When she spoke, her voice had lost all the artificial sweetness of the past few years. I think you've figured it all out, haven't you? Why? Edward asked, his voice hoarse. Why did you do this to him? To us? Helen laughed, but the sound was cold, devoid of humor. Do you really want to know? Or would you rather keep living in the fantasy that I was the perfect woman devotedly caring for your sick father? Edward felt the world spin around him. The woman before him was a stranger, someone who had shared his bed, his house, his life for 3 years, but whom he had never really known. I want to know the truth. Helen walked to the window, looking out at the garden, where Francis used to spend his mornings before the stroke. The truth is, your father never accepted me. The truth is, he saw right through me from day one. He knew I wasn't here for love, but for personal gain. And were you? Of course I was. Helen turned to him, her face a mask of coldness. Do you think a woman like me would be interested in a man like you if it weren't for what you could offer me? The words hit Edward like daggers. He had fallen in love with Helen, believed in her dedication, trusted her completely. Then why did you stay? Why not just end it and leave? Because your father was in the way, Helen said simply. As long as he was capable of making decisions, I would never have real access to the family's assets. The stroke was an opportunity. Edward felt physically ill. The coldness with which Helen spoke about his father's situation was more disturbing than he could have imagined. You kept him sedated on purpose. I kept him comfortable and under control. Under control for what? Helen smiled, and for the first time in 3 years, the smile was genuine, and that made it even more terrifying. To get what I came for. The company, the properties, the accounts, everything is being gradually transferred. Your father signed all the necessary papers. He was sedated when he signed them, but he signed them, and that's what matters legally. Edward looked at the documents in his hands, then at Helen, the woman he had loved, whom he had brought into his family, whom he had trusted with his father's life, was a calculating and dangerous stranger. You're going to give it all back now. Helen laughed again. Or what? You'll report me? With what proof? Your father is a senile old man who can barely speak coherently. Who's going to believe him over a dedicated caregiver who sacrificed 3 years of her life to care for him? Edward realized with growing horror that Helen had thought of everything. She had built a perfect public narrative, the devoted young woman caring for her sick father-in-law while the son worked. Who would question that version? The medication, Edward said. I can prove you were giving him unprescribed drugs. The medications were prescribed. I have medical reports to prove it. Forged reports. Prove it, Helen challenged. Edward felt trapped. Helen had orchestrated everything with precision, creating layers of legal and social protection that would make it almost impossible to undo what she had done. But then he remembered the boy. The child who had exposed the truth with his innocent honesty. If there were other people who had witnessed Helen's real behavior, other people who could confirm that Francis was being held against his will. There are witnesses, Edward said. A 10-year-old child and a caregiver desperate for a job. Against me? Against all the documents I have? Helen was right, and they both knew it. But Edward wasn't willing to give up. Not while there was a spark of consciousness in his father. Not while there was a chance to correct the terrible mistake he had made in trusting that woman. "I'm going to fight this," he said, his voice gaining determination. "You can try," Helen replied, walking toward the door. "But remember one thing, Edward. I know all your secrets, all your weaknesses. If you decide to confront me, you'll find that I'm a much more dangerous opponent than you imagine." She left the office, leaving Edward alone with the documents and the devastating reality that he had handed his father's life over to a predator. Outside, the sun finally broke through the clouds, illuminating the garden Francis so loved. But for Edward, the world would never be the same. He ran upstairs to his father's room, where he found Francis awake and Mrs. Marcia sitting beside him, both looking more alert than Edward had seen them in months. "Dad," Edward said, sitting on the edge of the bed. "We're getting out of here." Francis held his son's hand, his eyes shining with tears of relief. "Son," he whispered, "I knew you'd find out the truth. I always knew." And in that moment, Edward understood that the battle to come wasn't just about money or property. It was about dignity, about family, about an elderly person's right to live their final years with respect and love, not as a prisoner in their own home. The war had begun, but for the first time in 3 years, Edward knew exactly who he was fighting against. The next 2 days passed like a macabre dance of forced normality. Helen continued her routine as if nothing had changed. She organized meals, supervised the house, smiled at Edward during dinner. But now he saw through the mask. Every affectionate gesture was calculated. Every word of concern for Francis was a performance. Edward, for his part, pretended to believe her version. He started leaving for work earlier and coming home later, claiming urgent problems at the company. In reality, he was investigating. He looked for Dr. Mendoza, the doctor who had supposedly prescribed the blue pills. The man had no idea what Edward was talking about. He had never prescribed sedatives for Francis beyond the first 2 months after the stroke. "Actually," the doctor said during the impromptu consultation in his office, "I was concerned when you cancelled the regular appointments. Your father was recovering well, as expected. Cancelled the appointments. Your wife called about 2 months ago saying you had found a better specialist. I thought it was normal, but..." Edward's blood ran cold. Helen had isolated Francis, not only physically but also medically. She had cut off all ties that could expose her sham. "Doctor, I need you to examine my father again, urgently." "Of course, but he'll need to come here. I don't make house calls anymore." Edward knew Helen would never allow Francis to leave the house for a medical appointment. He needed a different strategy. That's when he remembered Connie. His father's former caregiver lived in a simple neighborhood, 40 minutes from the mansion. Edward had never visited her home before. All their interactions had been professional. But when he knocked on her door on that rainy afternoon, Connie received him as if she had been expecting his visit for months. "Mr. Edward," she said, opening the door wide. "Please come in. I was wondering when you would come looking for me." The house was small but cozy, smelling of coffee and homemade cake. Connie served him a cup and sat across from him at the wooden kitchen table. "You knew I would come?" Connie smiled sadly. "Mr. Francis was like a father to me. I took care of him since your mother passed away. I saw him every day, knew his every gesture, every expression. When that woman dismissed me, I knew something was wrong. Why didn't you say anything at the time?" "I did. I tried to talk to you, sir. But she always found an excuse to keep me from speaking with you alone. And when I insisted, she threatened me." Edward felt a wave of guilt. Connie had tried to warn him, and he had been too blind to see. "How did she threaten you?" "She said if I spread lies about her, she would sue me for defamation. She said she had lawyers who would prove I was making up stories out of revenge for being fired. And my father. How was he when you were dismissed? Connie closed her eyes, as if the memory was painful. He cried, Mr. Edward. A 70-year-old man cried like a child when I said goodbye. He tried to speak, but the words wouldn't come out right. I saw fear in his eyes, pure fear. Edward swallowed the lump in his throat. Connie, I need your help. I need to get my father out of there. What can I do? First, I need a witness to what was happening before Helen arrived. Second, I need someone I trust to take care of him when I manage to get him out of the house. Connie didn't hesitate. You can count on me. Mr. Francis is family to me. Edward explained his plan. It was risky, but it might be the only chance to save his father before Helen could transfer the rest of the family's assets. That evening, Edward came home earlier than usual. Helen found it odd but didn't comment. During dinner, he feigned renewed interest in his father's care. I was thinking, he said, cutting his meat with deliberately casual movements. It's been a while since my father has been out of the house. How about we take him for a walk in the garden tomorrow? Helen almost choked on her wine. Do you think that's safe? He's so fragile. They would be safe in a wheelchair. Just a few minutes in the fresh air. I don't know, Edward. What if he gets agitated? What if he has a relapse? Edward studied Helen's expression. There was real panic in her eyes. Not concern for Francis's well-being, but fear of losing control. It's just an idea, he said, pretending to give up easily. You know his condition better. Helen visibly relaxed. Maybe some other time, when he's more stable. After dinner, Edward went up to check on his father. Francis was awake, looking out the window at the garden illuminated by the outdoor lights. How are you feeling, Dad? Better, Francis said, and his voice indeed sounded clearer. Without those blue pills, my head is clearer. Mrs. Marcia isn't giving them to you anymore. She tries, but I pretend to swallow them and then spit them out. She understands. Edward smiled. Even in his weakened state, Francis retained the shrewdness that had made him a successful businessman. Dad, I need you to hold on for a few more days. I'm arranging a way to get you out of here. Francis held his son's hand. Son, there's something I need to tell you. About that woman. What is it? There are other men. She meets with someone when you travel. Edward felt the world spin. Was Helen cheating on him in addition to robbing his family? Are you sure? I saw it from the window. Several times. A man in a suit, a black car. They meet in the garden pavilion. Edward closed his eyes. The personal betrayal hurt, but it also presented an opportunity. If he could document Helen's extramarital affair, he would have more legal ammunition. Dad, when was the last time you saw them together? Last week. Always on Thursday afternoons when you're at the office. Thursday. It was Tuesday. Edward had 2 days to prepare. The next morning, he invented a business trip for Thursday. Helen showed neither sadness nor surprise. She just accepted the information with a kiss on the cheek that now felt cold on Edward's lips. Thursday arrived rainy and grey. Edward left home early, but instead of travelling, he parked on a side road with a view of the property. At 2 in the afternoon, he saw a black BMW drive up the private road to the mansion. Edward approached discreetly, using the dense garden vegetation as camouflage. The man who got out of the car was elegant, middle-aged, wearing an expensive suit. Edward recognized him. Mr. August Ferreira, the lawyer who had helped with Francis's documents. Helen met him at the back door, away from the main windows of the house. The meeting was brief, 40 minutes, but Edward managed to photograph the two of them entering and leaving the garden pavilion together. The images weren't explicit, but they clearly showed an intimacy that went beyond professional relations. When the lawyer left, Edward waited another 20 minutes before returning home. Claiming the trip had been cancelled, Helen seemed genuinely surprised by his early return. Did something happen? Problem with the meeting. The client cancelled at the last minute. Edward watched Helen's face carefully. There was nervousness in her eyes, a tension she tried to hide behind her usual smile. That night, Edward called Connie and arranged the rescue for the next day. He also contacted a private investigator recommended by a lawyer friend. The photographs and Connie's testimony would be the beginning, but he needed more solid evidence. Friday dawned clear. Edward pretended everything was normal during breakfast, but his nerves were on edge. Helen talked about her plans for the weekend, a charity gala she was organizing. "It'll be at the club," she said, spreading jam on her toast. "A lot of important people will be there. It'll be good for business." Edward nodded but wasn't listening. His mind was focused on what would happen in the next few hours. At 10 in the morning, after Helen left for an appointment at the salon, Edward put his plan into action. Connie arrived in a discreet van, accompanied by 2 private nurses Edward had hired. Mrs. Marcia greeted them with tears in her eyes. "Thank God," she whispered. "I couldn't bear to see Mr. Francis like that anymore." Francis was awake and alert. When he saw Connie enter the room, his eyes filled with tears. "Connie," he said, his voice choked. "You came back. I came to get you, Mr. Francis. We're getting out of here." The transfer process was quick but careful. Edward had rented a small, cozy house 20 kilometers from the mansion, far enough to keep Francis safe, but close enough for him to visit daily. When Helen arrived home at 2 in the afternoon, she found an empty mansion and a letter from Edward on the dining room table. "Helen, I've taken my father to a place where he will receive proper care. I know what you did. I know about the fake medications, the forged documents, everything. I also know about you and Mr. Ferreira. You have 48 hours to return all the assets you illegally transferred and to leave my property. Otherwise, I will file a full lawsuit." Edward. Helen read the letter 3 times, her hands trembling. Then she picked up the phone and dialed a number she knew by heart. "August? We have a problem." But Edward had anticipated this reaction. The private investigator was already monitoring Helen's phones and movements. Every contact with her accomplice lawyer, every attempt to hide evidence, was being documented. That afternoon, for the first time in 3 years, Francis Silva sat in a chair in the garden of a simple house, breathing fresh air, with Connie by his side and Edward holding his hand. The sun shone in the clear sky, and for the first time in a long time, Francis smiled. "Son," he said, his voice stronger than Edward remembered, "thank you for saving me." Edward looked at his father, still frail, still marked by the stroke, but with his dignity restored, and knew he had done the right thing. The legal battle that would follow would be difficult, but it didn't matter. He had recovered what truly mattered, the chance to care for his father with love and respect. In the distance, on a road that cut through the fields, a skinny boy pedaled an old bicycle, whistling a cheerful tune. He didn't know that his innocent words had saved a life and destroyed a carefully constructed sham. For him, it was just another summer day, full of possibilities and simple truths that only children have the courage to speak. Helen's response came on Monday, not in a letter or a phone call, but through a battalion of lawyers who stormed Edward's office like a storm in elegant suits. Mr. August Ferreira led the group, his cold, calculating eyes hidden behind gold-rimmed glasses. "Mr. Edward," Ferreira said, placing a pile of documents on the table, "my client is deeply hurt by your baseless accusations." Edward looked at the papers without touching them. He had prepared for this reaction, but the speed and organization of Helen's response still impressed him. Baseless accusations? "Mrs. Helen dedicated 3 years of her life to devotedly caring for your father," Ferreira continued. "It's only natural that, in gratitude, he decided to leave part of his assets to the one who truly cared for his well-being, when he was sedated and unable to make his own decisions." Ferreira smiled, a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Your father signed all the documents in full consciousness, witnessed by qualified professionals. We have medical reports proving his mental capacity at the time of the signatures. Edward knew those reports, the same forged documents he had found in Helen's safe. But Ferreira was right about one thing. Legally, it would be difficult to prove the sham. And what about the unprescribed medications? What medications? Ferreira spread his hands in a gesture of innocence. All the drugs administered to Mr. Francis were duly prescribed by competent doctors. Edward knew he was in an unequal battle. Helen and Ferreira had built an almost impenetrable legal wall, but he had something they didn't expect. The truth was finally free to speak. "I'd like you to meet someone," Edward said. Opening the office door, Connie entered, elegantly dressed, but with the serene dignity of someone who knows her own worth. Behind her, leaning on a cane but walking with determination, came Francis Silver. The silence that followed was deafening. Ferreira turned pale, clearly not expecting to see Francis standing and lucid. The other lawyers exchanged nervous glances. "Dad," Edward said, "would you like to tell these gentlemen how you've been feeling?" Francis approached the table, his gaze fixed on Ferreira. When he spoke, his voice was clear and firm, with no trace of the lethargy that had characterized his last few years. "Mr. Ferreira," Francis said, and the lawyer instinctively recoiled. "How much did Helen pay you to forge my signature on those documents?" "Mr. Francis, you're not well. Perhaps you should go back home." "This is my home now," Francis interrupted, sitting in a chair with an authority that reminded everyone in the room of who he had been before the stroke. "And my mind is perfectly clear, thank you. Clear enough to remember every time Helen forced me to take those blue pills. Clear enough to remember every document you made me sign while I could barely keep my eyes open." Ferreira tried to maintain his composure, but Edward could see the panic growing in his eyes. "Mr. Francis, you're being manipulated by your son. Helen always took care of you with dedication." "Dedication?" Francis laughed, but the sound was bitter. "Is that what you call locking a man in his own room, preventing him from receiving visitors, swapping his medication for sedatives? We have no knowledge of—" "Connie," Francis turned to the former caregiver, "tell these gentlemen what you saw during the 2 years you cared for me." Connie approached, taking a small recorder from her pocket. "I recorded our conversation from last week. Mr. Francis, as you asked." She pressed play, and Francis's voice filled the office, clear and detailed, recounting 3 years of systematic abuse, medical negligence, and psychological manipulation. The recording lasted 15 minutes, and with each word, the lawyers seemed to shrink in their chairs. When the recording finished, the silence was sepulchral. "Gentlemen," Edward said, "in addition to my father's and Connie's testimony, we have photographs of Helen in intimate encounters with Mr. Ferreira, medical records proving that the administered medications were never prescribed by my father's real doctors, and analyses of the documents showing irregularities in the signatures." Ferreira stood up abruptly. "This is a setup. Helen would never—" "Helen has already confessed," Edward interrupted calmly. "We have it all on tape. It wasn't true. Helen hadn't formally confessed, but Edward knew the bluff might work. And it did." Ferreira turned even paler, if that was possible. "You're bluffing. Want to bet?" Edward smiled for the first time in that meeting. "Or would you rather hear the offer I have to make?" Ferreira hesitated, clearly torn between calling the bluff and protecting himself. "What offer?" "Helen returns all the illegally transferred assets. You nullify all the fraudulent documents, and I commit to not pressing criminal charges against anyone involved." "And if we refuse?" Edward opened a folder on the table, revealing piles of documents and photographs. "Then tomorrow morning, all of this will be in the hands of the district attorney. Document fraud, embezzlement, prescription forgery, elder abuse, administration of medication without a prescription." Edward paused dramatically. "How many years in prison do you think that adds up to?" Ferreira looked at the other lawyers, then at Francis, who was watching him with a look that mixed disappointment and determination. "We need to speak with our client." "You have until 5 p.m. tomorrow," Edward said. After that, the offer expires. The lawyers left in silence, leaving behind an air of defeat that starkly contrasted with the arrogance they had shown upon arrival. When they were alone, Francis held his son's hand. "Son, are you sure you want to give her this chance?" Edward looked out the window, watching the trees sway in the wind. In a distant part of his mind, he still loved the woman he thought he knew. But that woman had never really existed. "It's not for her, Dad. It's for us. I don't want our family to be remembered for a legal scandal that would last for years." Francis nodded slowly. "You were always wise, son. Wiser than I was at your age. I learned from you." Connie, who had remained discreet throughout the meeting, approached. "Mr. Francis, it's time for lunch and physical therapy." Edward watched his father stand up with some difficulty, but without help. In just 1 week away from Helen's sedatives, Francis had regained much of his mobility and mental clarity. Dr. Mendoza had been impressed with the improvement. "Actually," the doctor had said during a recent consultation, "your father always had the potential for a much better recovery. The sedatives he was taking prevented any real progress." That afternoon, Edward received an unexpected call. It was the boy, or rather his mother, explaining that her son insisted on speaking with the man from the big house. "He won't stop asking about the old man," the woman said, visibly embarrassed. "He said he has something important to tell him." Edward asked them to bring the boy to the house where Francis was staying. When they arrived, the boy ran to Francis, who was sitting in the garden, and hugged him with the spontaneity that only children possess. "Mr. Francis, you're walking." Francis smiled, the first genuine smile Edward had seen in years. "I am, my boy. Thanks to you. Because of me? You told the truth when the adults couldn't see it. That saved me." The boy was silent for a moment, processing the information with the seriousness children reserve for important things. "My mum said I said something I shouldn't have." "Sometimes," Francis said, "the things we shouldn't say are exactly the ones that need to be said." Edward watched the scene, feeling a mixture of gratitude and admiration. That boy, with his disarming honesty, had broken a cycle of abuse that could have lasted for years. "How did you know something was wrong?" Edward asked. The boy thought for a moment. "He always tried to wave at me when I rode my bike by. But then she started closing the curtains. And one time I saw him crying alone. Grown-ups don't cry alone for no reason." The simplicity of the observation was devastating. A child had noticed what Edward, blinded by love and trust, had failed to see. That night, Edward received a call from Ferreira. "My client accepts the terms." "All of them?" "All of them. The transfer documents will be nullified tomorrow morning. The assets will return to the original estate." Edward closed his eyes, feeling a relief he hadn't expected. "And Helen, she will leave the property by the end of the week." Edward hung up the phone and went to tell his father the news. Francis received the news in silence, nodding slowly. "She was very smart," he said finally. "Smart and dangerous. If it weren't for that boy, I might never have woken up to reality." Francis looked at his son with a serious expression. "Edward, promise me one thing." "Anything, Dad." "Never again let work or anything else stop you from seeing what's happening to the people you love. Family is all we have that's real in this world." Edward held his father's hand, feeling the weight of the promise he was making. "I promise, Dad, never again." Outside, the wind swayed the trees of the modest garden where Francis now lived. It was a simple house, without the luxury of the mansion, but filled with something the property had long lost: peace. And for the first time in 3 years, Francis Silva slept without fear, knowing he was safe, loved, and free. The house of cards had finally collapsed, taking with it the lies, the manipulations, and the secrets. What remained was the raw, painful, but liberating truth, like sunlight after a long storm. Saturday dawned with a clear sky and a different kind of silence hanging over the mansion. Edward arrived early, still hesitant to step into the place that for 3 years had been a home, but which now seemed contaminated by painful memories. The keys trembled in his hands as he opened the main door. Helen had left in the dead of night, like a shadow that disappears with the first light of day. There were no final confrontations, no tearful goodbyes, just the emptiness of cleared drawers, clothes-less closets, and a perfume that still lingered in the air like the last trace of a well-told lie. Edward walked through the rooms, each step echoing differently. The house seemed larger now, more expansive, as if the walls had expanded with the departure of the tension that had inhabited them. In the dining room, the table was still set for 3, a habit Helen had maintained even when Francis spent entire days without coming down for meals. His father's room was exactly as Edward remembered it from his childhood. Solid dark wood furniture, curtains that allowed generous morning light to enter, and a privileged view of the garden that Francis loved so much, without the vials of fake medication on the bedside table, without the wheelchair positioned like a prison in the center of the room. The space breathed again. Edward sat in the armchair where he used to listen to his father's stories as a child. He closed his eyes and tried to capture those happy memories, but other images imposed themselves. Francis trying to get up and being stopped, his pleading eyes asking for help that never came. The silent tears that witnessed a suffering Edward had been too blind to see. The sound of tires on the gravel road interrupted his thoughts. Through the window he saw the familiar van, Connie arriving with Francis for what would be his first visit back to the mansion since the rescue. Edward went down the stairs and opened the door, finding his father leaning on a cane, but walking with steadier steps than the week before. Daily physical therapy was working wonders, but more than that, his regained dignity had given Francis a strength that the counterfeit drugs had stolen. "How does it feel to be back here, Dad?" Francis looked around, his eyes scanning every detail of the main entrance. When he spoke, his voice carried a serenity that surprised Edward. "It's strange," he said slowly. "For 3 years this house was a prison. Now it's just a house." Connie followed them inside, carrying a small suitcase. "I brought Mr. Francis's things," she explained, "in case he wants to sleep here tonight." Edward looked at his father, surprised. "You want to stay?" Francis walked to the living room window, contemplating the garden he had so loved. The flowers Helen had planted were still there, but something had changed. Maybe it was just perspective, or maybe the plants themselves knew that the true owner of the house had returned. "I can't run away forever," said Francis. "This house was my life. It's where I raised you, where your mother was happy. I won't let one person's lies destroy all those memories." Edward felt his chest tighten. His father's courage, still fragile but determined to reclaim his space, was both inspiring and painful. "Are you sure? It might be difficult." "Son," Francis turned to him, his eyes shining with a determination Edward hadn't seen in years, "I've learned that running from pain doesn't make it disappear. It only makes it stronger." They spent the day reorganizing the house. Edward removed all traces of Helen's presence, photographs, personal items, anything that might bring painful memories. Connie supervised the deep cleaning of Francis's room, airing out every corner, changing linens, returning the feeling of home that had been lost. In the middle of the afternoon, the sound of an old bicycle at the entrance surprised them. Edward looked out the window and smiled when he saw the boy stop near the main door, hesitant as always, but determined. "Shall I get that?" asked Connie. "I'll go," said Edward, walking to the door. The boy was holding a small pot with wildflower seedlings, his clothes showing signs that he had ridden a long way under the afternoon sun. "Hi, Mr. Edward," he said, a little out of breath. "I brought this for Mr. Francis." Edward looked at the seedlings, simple flowers, the kind that grew in the fields around the property, nothing elaborate or expensive, but chosen with the care that only children give to gifts. "He's here. Do you want to give it to him yourself?" The boy's eyes lit up. "Can I?" Edward led him inside, where Francis was sitting in the living room, flipping through an old photo album. When he saw the boy, his face lit up with a genuine smile. "My little hero, what brings you here?" The boy approached shyly, offering the pot. "I picked them from the field. My grandma said flowers brighten up a house." Francis received the gift with the solemnity of one who understands the true value of simple gestures. He examined each seedling carefully, as if they were the rarest flowers in the world. "They're beautiful," he said. "Shall we plant them in the garden?" The boy nodded enthusiastically, and Edward watched the two walk together towards the garden, the old man leaning on his cane and the child adjusting his pace to match. Connie approached Edward. "It's a beautiful sight, isn't it? Mr. Francis was always good with children. Helen didn't like it when they came to visit him. She didn't. She said they were noisy, that they might agitate him. But in truth, I think she just didn't like seeing him happy." Edward watched through the window as Francis taught the boy how to dig holes for the seedlings. The old man's hands trembled slightly, but he worked with patience, explaining about the soil, the water, and how to care for the plants so they would grow strong. "Connie," said Edward, "I want you to come back to work here." She turned, surprised. "Here at the mansion?" "If you agree. My father needs someone he trusts, and this house needs to become a home again." Connie smiled, tears shining in her eyes. "It would be an honor. Mr. Edward, Mr. Francis is family to me." At the end of the afternoon, the boy left on his bicycle, waving enthusiastically to Francis, who returned the gesture from the house door. The seedlings were planted in the main flower bed, small green specks of hope against the dark earth. During dinner, the first meal Edward and Francis had shared at the mansion since the truth was revealed, they talked about the future. Francis had decided to divide his time between the small house Edward had rented and the mansion. "I need to readjust slowly," he explained. 3 years of being controlled leaves its mark, but I don't want to give up this house. It has too much history to be abandoned. And work? The company?" Francis chewed slowly, thoughtfully. "I want to go back gradually. Not to command, those days are over, but to contribute. My mind is clear, son. I have experience that can be useful." Edward nodded. The idea of working with his father again, of having him as a counselor and partner, was comforting. "There's something else I want to discuss with you," said Francis, wiping his mouth with his napkin. "About that boy. What about him? I want to do something for him, for his family. Humble people who raised a child capable of seeing the truth when the adults were blind." Edward smiled. It was typical of his father to think of others, even after all he had been through. "What kind of thing?" "An education, a scholarship, something to ensure that his honesty is rewarded, not just now, but in the future." "That's a wonderful idea, Dad." Francis looked out the window, where the stars were beginning to appear in the dark sky. "You know, son, I spent a lot of time these last few years thinking my life was over, that I was a burden, a heavy responsibility you all carried out of obligation." "Dad, let me finish." Francis raised his hand gently. "Now I realize that life doesn't end as long as we can still love, teach, contribute. That boy saved me, but he also taught me something. The truth, even when spoken by a child, has the power to set you free." Edward held his father's hand, feeling the strength that still pulsed in those wrinkled fingers. "You taught me that long before he did. I just forgot along the way." "Then let's remember together," said Francis. "Let's rebuild this family on a foundation of truth." That night, Francis slept in his old room for the first time in a week. Edward stayed up late, walking through the house, feeling it breathe again. There were no more secrets hidden in safes, no more fake medications in drawers, no more fear lingering in the hallways. From the office window, he could see the seedlings the boy had planted, small silhouettes against the moonlit garden. They were just simple flowers, but they represented something bigger, the hope that even in the darkest circumstances, there is always room for growth, for renewal, for a new beginning. And somewhere in the house, Francis slept peacefully for the first time in 3 years, knowing he was home, protected by true love and the certainty that the truth, finally, had prevailed. 6 months later, the mansion had transformed back into a real home. The sound echoing through the halls was no longer the lonely clinking of silverware on porcelain, but the lively melody of a family that had learned to reconnect. Voices chatting, footsteps that didn't need to be silent, laughter that erupted spontaneously. The house breathed with a life of its own. Francis had recovered far more than Edward had ever dared to hope. Constant physical therapy, combined with the end of the sedatives and the return of his dignity, had given him a mobility that doctors considered remarkable. He still used a cane occasionally, especially on colder days, but he walked through the gardens with sure steps, tended to his flowers, and had resumed his passion for reading. One Sunday morning, Edward found his father in the library, absorbed in a book on sustainable agriculture. The morning light filtered through the open curtains, creating a golden atmosphere that highlighted Francis's serene expression. "Good morning, Dad. Studying?" Francis looked up, smiling. "Good morning, son. I was reading about modern cultivation techniques. I was thinking of expanding our vegetable garden." Our vegetable garden. Edward smiled at the words. Over the past few months, they had created a small garden of vegetables and herbs together at the back of the property. It was a modest project, but it had become a shared passion, precious moments of working together, talking about life, and making plans for the future. "Is the boy coming today?" Edward asked, sitting in the armchair next to his father. "Of course. It's Sunday. He never misses a Sunday." The boy's weekly presence had become a sacred tradition in the house. Every Sunday after lunch, he would arrive on his old bicycle, always with a simple gift: wildflowers, an interesting stone he found in the field, drawings he made at school. Francis awaited these visits with almost childish anticipation, always preparing some special activity for them to share. "How is he doing in school?" asked Edward. "Very well. His grades have improved a lot since he started at the private school. The teacher said he's an exceptional student, curious, honest, and generous." The scholarship Francis had arranged for the boy was discreet, channeled through a foundation, so the family wouldn't feel awkward. It was just a way to ensure that the child who had saved their lives had opportunities to grow and prosper. Edward watched his father flip through the pages of the book, noticing how his eyes shone with genuine interest. It was hard to believe that just a few months ago, this same man had seemed lost in a fog of medication and silent despair. "Dad, can I ask you something?" "Of course. Did you ever hate me for being so blind? For letting Helen do that to you?" Francis closed the book slowly, carefully marking the page. When he looked at Edward, his eyes held not anger or resentment, but a deep understanding that came with age and experience. "Son," he said, his voice calm and firm, "true love sometimes makes us vulnerable. You loved someone who didn't deserve that love, and that allowed her to manipulate not only you, but our entire family. But the fact that you were able to love so deeply, even if it was misplaced, fills me with pride. But I should have noticed." "Should you have? Maybe. But what matters is that when the truth was revealed, you acted with courage and determination. You saved me, Edward. And more than that, you chose family over pride, truth over convenience." Edward felt his eyes well up. For months, he had carried the guilt of his blindness, questioning all the signs he had missed, all the opportunities he had wasted to protect his father. "Do you know what makes me proudest?" Francis continued. "It's that even after discovering the betrayal, you didn't become bitter or distrustful. You're still capable of love, of trust. That is true strength." The sound of footsteps on the porch interrupted the moment. Connie appeared at the library door, smiling. "Mr. Francis, your little friend has arrived." "And he didn't come alone today." Edward and Francis exchanged curious glances. They walked to the porch, where they found not only the boy, but also a slightly younger girl, clearly his sister, shyly holding his hand. "Hi, Mr. Francis." "Hi, Mr. Edward." said the boy with his usual enthusiasm. "I brought my sister, Maria. She wanted to meet you." The girl, about 8 years old, had the same large, curious eyes as her brother, but showed a shyness that contrasted with his confidence. Francis knelt with some difficulty, getting down to the children's level. "Hello, Maria, it's a pleasure to meet you. You have a beautiful name." The girl smiled shyly, whispering an almost inaudible "thank you." "She brought you a drawing," said the boy, pulling a folded piece of paper from his pocket. "She drew our whole family." Francis carefully unfolded the paper, revealing a colorful drawing made with crayons. It showed a simple house with 5 figures outside, the boy and his sister in the center, their parents on either side, and a little off to the side, a taller figure that was clearly Francis, depicted with a cane and a huge smile. "This is the most beautiful family I've ever seen," said Francis, his voice choked with emotion. "Can I keep it forever?" Maria nodded enthusiastically, her shyness beginning to fade. "My brother told me you have a garden with flowers." "I do. Would you like to see it?" The 2 children followed Francis through the gardens, while Edward and Connie watched them from the porch. The old man walked slowly, explaining about each plant, each flower, each small project he had developed in recent months. The children listened with absolute attention, asking questions and exclaiming with joy at every discovery. "It's beautiful to see," commented Connie. "Mr. Francis has been reborn with these children." "Not just with them," said Edward. "I think we've all been reborn a little." When they returned from their walk through the garden, the children were radiant, and Francis looked 10 years younger. Connie had prepared a special snack, chocolate cake, fresh juices and fruit, which they ate at the garden table, under the shade of an old oak tree. "Mr. Francis," said the boy between bites of cake, "my dad wanted to know if you need help with anything on the property." "How kind," replied Francis. "Actually, I was thinking of expanding the vegetable garden. If he's interested and has the time, I'd love the help." Edward watched the conversation, understanding that this was much more than a simple job offer. It was the natural formation of a mutual support network, a small community based on gratitude and respect. At the end of the afternoon, as the children were preparing to leave, Francis called the boy aside. "I have something for you," he said, handing him a small envelope. The boy opened it and found a handwritten letter and an old photo. "It's a picture of me with your grandfather," Francis explained. "We worked together on building the road that connects your community to the city. I want you to know that your family has always been important to ours." The boy looked at the photo with admiration, seeing his young grandfather next to Francis, both smiling and covered in dust, clearly proud of the work they were doing. "I'll show my dad and my grandma," he said, carefully putting the photo in his pocket. When the children left, waving from the bicycle, Maria sitting on the back rack, the property sank into a silence different from any Edward had experienced in that house. It was not the heavy silence of tension or fear, nor the empty silence of loneliness. It was the satisfied silence of a day well lived, of genuine connections established, of love shared without reservation. That night, during dinner, Francis made an announcement that surprised Edward. "Son, I have a proposal for you." "What is it?" "And I want to transform part of this property into a community space. A place where families from the area can come on weekends, where children can learn about agriculture, where older people can share their knowledge." Edward stopped eating, impressed by the breadth of his father's vision. "That's a big project. Dad, I have time, resources, and most importantly, purpose," said Francis. "That boy saved me with his honesty. Now I want to create a place where honesty and simplicity are celebrated. Like a community center? Something like that. With educational gardens, craft workshops, spaces for simple festivals. A place where different generations can meet and learn from each other." Edward looked at his father, seeing the passion shining in his eyes. It was the same fire that had made Francis a successful businessman, but now directed towards something greater than profit or personal prestige. "Count me in," said Edward. "It will be our project together." Francis smiled, extending his hand across the table. Edward took it, feeling the strength that still pulsed in those fingers that had built so much and now wanted to build even more. Later, alone in his room, Edward reflected on the journey that had brought them to this point. Helen had tried to destroy his family, but in the end, she had only revealed its true strength. The pain of betrayal had given way to gratitude. Gratitude for discovering the truth before it was too late. Gratitude for having a father whose dignity no manipulation could completely destroy. Gratitude for learning that true love is not blind, but sees. Francis was sleeping in the next room, a peaceful sleep that no longer needed to be induced by fake medications. Connie was in her quarters on the ground floor, content to be back where she had always belonged. And somewhere on the property, small seedlings were growing in the flower beds, living symbols that it is always possible to start over. In the silence of the night, Edward finally understood what the boy had unleashed with his simple words. He had not just exposed a lie, he had liberated a much greater truth. The truth that family is not just blood ties, but daily choices of love, care, and mutual protection. The truth that dignity is not something lost with age or illness, but something preserved through respect and compassion. The truth that honesty, even when it comes from unexpected sources, has the power to heal wounds that seemed incurable. Outside, the wind swayed the trees gently, creating whispers that now sounded like songs of freedom. The mansion was at peace, its inhabitants safe, its history rewritten on foundations of truth and love, and in Edward's heart there was a serene certainty. Some prisons can only be broken by the courage to face the truth. Some families can only be saved by the strength to choose love over convenience. And some freedoms are only truly appreciated by those who have known the weight of chains. The silence that now inhabited the house was not that of oppression, but of peace. A silence that said without words that the truth, when it finally finds its voice, is the only sound that truly sets you free. If this story touched your heart, like, comment, and subscribe. Stories like this deserve to be remembered.